What happens when a prince demands to be treated like royalty, only to be told, "Not here"? There are moments in history when titles, crowns, and centuries of tradition collide violently with the modern world, and those moments don't always happen in grand palaces or royal courts. Sometimes they unfold under the blinding lights of a tech-forward summit, on a stage built for thought leaders, innovators, and disruptors. And this time, it happened at the NEXUS 2025 Summit in New York, a sleek, hyper-connected gathering of the world's most influential changemakers. But it wasn't innovation or philanthropy that made headlines that day. It was a royal temper tantrum. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The world didn't expect the drama to come from Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, a man who, just a few years ago, captivated the globe by walking away from the royal family, vowing to live on his own terms. But inside the hushed green room of the NEXUS main stage, amid bustling assistants and high-profile CEOs, something broke. And it wasn't just royal protocol. Eyewitnesses said it started quietly. Prince Harry, set to be one of the keynote speakers on a panel about humanitarian leadership in digital spaces, arrived flanked by handlers and security. Dressed in a tailored but understated charcoal suit, no medals, no regalia, no royal insignia, Harry looked like any other major figure on the lineup. But something was different. He carried an expectation, a presence that silently insisted, "I am not just another guest. I am royalty." The tension simmered as Gerol, the no-nonsense CEO and co-founder of NEXUS, personally greeted speakers backstage. Known for her crisp professionalism, egalitarian principles, and no-frills style, Gerol had built her reputation on fostering a space where status didn't overshadow substance. Everyone, whether billionaire, scientist, or senator, was addressed by their first name and given equal footing. When she greeted Harry with a simple "Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, we're so glad to have you here," the air shifted. Multiple sources backstage said there was an awkward pause. Harry reportedly offered a tight smile but said nothing. His aides stiffened. Gerol moved on. But the seed had been planted. Moments later, as preparations for the panel discussion got underway, staff were instructed to avoid referring to Harry with his royal title, something allegedly directed from the top of the NEXUS leadership. Consistent with their policy for all speakers, the nameplate at his reserved seat read, "Harry Mountbatten Windsor." Not Prince Harry. Not the Duke of Sussex. Just Harry. What happened next would become tabloid gold, social media dynamite, and royal PR's worst nightmare. Sources from inside the venue say that Harry, upon noticing the nameplate and being told again that his title would not be used in the formal program or by event staff, lost it. Witnesses describe a startling escalation. Harry standing up abruptly, throwing off the discreet wireless mic clip to his lapel, and demanding to see who authorized this. He shouted something like, "I was born a prince. You will address me as one," said one backstage producer who requested anonymity. He was clearly upset. But he wasn't just angry, he seemed hurt. Like he felt erased. According to another staffer, what began as a tense disagreement quickly spiraled. Harry was heard saying, "I'm not your average speaker. I'm royalty whether you like it or not." That's when security reportedly stepped in to de-escalate. The situation, they say, was heading into very public embarrassment territory. By then, whispers had already begun to ripple through the summit. Other speakers, delegates, and media guests could sense that something was off. Word spread like digital wildfire. Prince Harry had stormed off backstage. The Duke was demanding to be addressed as royalty. Gerol stood firm. And NEXUS, known for its progressive values and anti-elitist approach, wasn't budging. What made the moment so significant, even surreal, was the backdrop against which it occurred. This wasn't Buckingham Palace. This was a 21st-century forum built on the premise that no person, regardless of background, holds more value than another. A place where tech innovators from African villages sat next to Ivy League scholars. Where climate activists shared equal billing with crypto entrepreneurs. A place that, by design, didn't care who your father was or whether you once rode in a golden carriage. And yet, in that space, Harry seemed to be waging a silent war not just for recognition, but for identity. For the last few years, the world has watched Harry's transformation, or attempted transformation, from royal heir to independent advocate. His departure from royal duties in 2020 was dramatic, controversial, and shrouded in media firestorms. With Meghan Markle by his side, He declared independence from the crown, rejecting the monarchy's restrictions and institutional rigidity. He relocated to California. He inked media deals. He launched mental health initiatives. And, perhaps most critically, he insisted that he was no longer beholden to the Windsor legacy. So why did being called Mr. Mountbatten Windsor ignite such fury? That question cuts to the core of this unfolding drama because it speaks to a contradiction that has haunted Harry for years. On one hand, he has rejected the palace. On the other, he seems to crave the respect, status, and reverence that comes with the title he renounced. He wants it both ways, said one royal historian during a television panel the day after the incident. He wants to be free of the institution, but not free of the identity. And unfortunately, that's not how identity works, at least not in the public arena. Indeed, Gerol's refusal to use the title may have been procedural, but its impact was personal. To Harry, it may have felt like erasure. To Gerol, it was consistency. To the media, it was gold. By the time the panel went live, Harry's chair sat empty. Another speaker quietly filled in. The moderator offered no explanation. But the real story wasn't happening on stage. It was unfolding in real time on phones and news feeds around the world. Later that day, Nexus released a brief, unbothered statement. Our forum is built on the principles of inclusion, equity, and mutual respect. We treat all participants equally, regardless of background or title. There was no mention of Harry, no apology, no concession. Just a firm reinforcement of their values. Harry's team, in contrast, remained silent for nearly 48 hours. When they finally did issue a statement through a US-based publicist, it was carefully worded. Prince Harry was honored to be invited to the NEXUS 2025 Summit. Unfortunately, due to a misunderstanding regarding participation expectations, he chose not to appear on stage. But by then, the damage was done, not just reputational, but emotional. In the hours that followed, op-eds sprang up across the Atlantic. British tabloids mocked the man without a kingdom. American outlets raised questions about celebrity entitlement. Social media debated whether Gerol had overstepped or whether Harry had overreacted. The split was sharp. For some, Harry was a victim of modern-day ego-shaming. For others, he had revealed the very entitlement he claimed to have escaped. And underneath it all sat a much deeper issue, the psychological cost of identity dislocation. What happens when someone spends their life in a gilded institution, then steps out into the world to find the title they thought defined them no longer holds power? What happens when the nameplate at your chair, the one without Prince, becomes a symbol of everything you've lost or can no longer demand? This wasn't just a meltdown. This was an unraveling. A moment where two realities collided, the democratic energy of the 21st century world and the lingering weight of royal expectation. And so the stage is set. In the chapters that follow, we will take you deeper into every angle of this explosive moment, from the rise of Rachel Gerol as a modern leader who challenged centuries of tradition in a single handshake, to Harry's inner circle and their frantic attempts to manage the fallout. We'll investigate the hidden tension between Meghan and Harry post-incident, the palace's muted but deliberate silence, and the global implications of a prince being told, bluntly, not here. But this is more than just a story about a title. It's about identity, ego, and the human need to be seen. Because when the crown no longer fits, and the world no longer bows, what remains? From the outside, the NEXUS Summit looks like a melting pot of idealists and realists, a polished fusion of high-level impact investors, socially conscious entrepreneurs, and youthful visionaries gathering under one roof to exchange ideas that aim to change the world. But peel back the layers and you find something more potent. This is no ordinary conference. The NEXUS Summit is, for many, a proving ground, where the old guard meets the next generation, where celebrity doesn't necessarily equate to credibility, and where titles mean little if not matched with substance. It's a place where prestige isn't inherited, it's demonstrated. To understand why the NEXUS 2025 Summit was such a crucial turning point for Prince Harry, and why his presence sparked controversy before he even stepped on stage, we have to rewind the tape and explore what the summit represents, who runs it, and how it became the battleground for a larger cultural collision. Founded in the early 2010s, the NEXUS Global Summit was conceived at the intersection of millennial entrepreneurship and global philanthropy. In its earliest days, it was a forum for young millionaires and innovators under the age of 40 to collaborate on social ventures. But it quickly evolved into something more ambitious, something that straddled influence and ideology, bringing together leaders in artificial intelligence, global finance, sustainability, education, and human rights. It wasn't just about networking or pitching ideas. It was about mobilizing power for purpose. By the time 2025 arrived, Nexus had expanded into a globally recognized platform operating across dozens of countries. The annual summit in New York had become a marquee event on the international calendar, drawing attendees ranging from heads of state to social media influencers. Presidents, poets, engineers, musicians, diplomats, athletes, and policy activists walked the same halls, often dressed in minimalist tech gear rather than designer fashion. Titles didn't dominate the dialogue, passion did. And at the center of this evolution was Gerol, the woman whose name would be hurled across headlines after her now infamous standoff with Prince Harry. Gerol wasn't born into money or power. Her story is the antithesis of royal privilege. The daughter of a public school teacher and a nurse from Madison, Wisconsin, Gerol carved her path through a combination of academic grit and grassroots organizing. She studied at NYU, built her reputation through social impact consulting in developing countries, and co-founded Nexus with the goal of tearing down elitist gatekeeping in global influence spaces. She didn't believe in formal hierarchy. She believed in human capital. To Gerol, it didn't matter whether you were the son of a monarch or the daughter of a farmer. If your ideas could move humanity forward, you were welcome. If your contributions relied solely on your last name or inherited status, the welcome was polite, but the pedestal was absent. Which brings us back to Prince Harry. Harry's appearance at Nexus 2025 wasn't entirely unexpected. For years, he and Meghan had embedded themselves in philanthropic and media-driven ecosystems. Their work on mental health, racial equity, veteran support, and climate advocacy had earned them both praise and scrutiny. The Archwell Foundation, their post-royal venture, had partnered with various nonprofits and think tanks. Their Netflix and Spotify deals had mixed commercial success but kept them in the spotlight. So when whispers circulated that Harry had been approached by Nexus organizers to speak on a panel about redefining leadership in the Global South, there was initial intrigue. However, it wasn't long before questions arose. What qualified Harry to speak on that panel? Was his inclusion based on his work or his name? According to internal emails leaked to a journalist days after the summit's disruption, Harry's team had pushed aggressively to get him on a high-profile panel, not as an audience member or a breakout room contributor, but on the main stage. They reportedly emphasized his royal heritage and international recognition as assets that could draw media attention and bolster attendance. That strategy may have worked in corporate galas or Hollywood fundraisers. But in the world of Nexus, such arguments were met with skepticism. Gerol, according to insiders, was wary of the optics. While she respected Harry's intentions and supported mental health work, she questioned the depth of his engagement in issues affecting the Global South, particularly when local activists with direct lived experience had applied for those same speaking slots. Nevertheless, a compromise was reached. Harry would be featured, but with stipulations. He would be introduced not by title, but by name. He would share space on stage equally, not dominated. And, most controversially, there would be no royal formalities, no HRH, no Duke, and no preferential treatment. Harry accepted. Or at least, his team did. But those close to the planning process said there were red flags even then. One Nexus organizer, speaking under anonymity, recalled a tense Zoom meeting where Harry's assistant questioned whether the absence of Prince in official documents was a typo or a policy. Another recalled a specific exchange. They asked, "Would you refer to Barack Obama as Mr. Obama?" And Rachel said, "Yes." And he wouldn't mind. Because he gets it. That answer may have encapsulated the difference in worldview. To Gerol and the Nexus community, legacy meant little without impact. To Prince Harry, legacy was impact. That distinction, subtle on paper but seismic in practice, would eventually explode under the heat of spotlight and pride. It's worth noting that Harry wasn't the only high-profile figure at Nexus 2025. The summit also hosted figures like Malala Yousafzai, Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi, and a host of indigenous leaders from the Amazon and sub-Saharan Africa. These were individuals who had risked their lives or dedicated decades to their causes. Many came without entourages, without speaking fees, without nameplate requests. For them, being heard was the reward. Being glorified was unnecessary. Harry entered that space with an aura. But that aura wasn't impenetrable. In interviews conducted days after the summit, several panelists noted that the environment was intentionally stripped of celebrity clout. One speaker, a climate justice advocate from Kenya, said, "This isn't Ken. You don't get a standing ovation for showing up. You earn your voice here." Even more revealing was how Harry's presence was viewed by the younger attendees, Gen Z founders, climate coders, and grassroots organizers. Many expressed admiration for his mental health advocacy, but admitted they were confused about why he was chosen for the leadership panel. "He's famous, not foundational," one participant posted on X. "That matters." Rachel Gerol had anticipated the potential for friction, but what she may not have anticipated was the emotional weight Harry brought into the space. He wasn't just there to speak, he was there to be seen, to be affirmed, to be told, implicitly or explicitly, that he still mattered beyond the boundaries of the palace gates. But Nexus is not designed to affirm inherited status. It is designed to challenge it. That clash, silent at first, was inevitable. When Harry saw the program pamphlet and noticed his name listed without the word Prince, his internal alarm may have gone off. When Rachel greeted him simply as Harry, that alarm grew louder. When the staff reiterated that it was standard Nexus policy to forego titles altogether, the alarm became a siren. The irony is that Harry's message, the one he intended to share on stage, was reportedly built around dismantling hierarchical power systems and creating space for underrepresented voices. But when confronted with the very culture he claimed to support, he buckled. This wasn't about malice. It was about misalignment. Nexus 2025 wasn't designed to humiliate him, but it was designed to humble everyone. And in that crucible of modern values, one man's title became a fault line, not because of what it meant to others, but because of what it still meant to him. The incident, once viewed through this lens, becomes more than just a backstage drama. It becomes a mirror. It reflects how society views legacy, how individuals respond to status loss, and how institutions like the royal family still echo through the chambers of personal identity even after they're supposedly left behind. This section lays the groundwork for what happens next: the outburst, the global reaction, the emotional unraveling, and the conversation about where Prince Harry truly belongs in a world that no longer boasts. When the story first broke, it seemed too surreal to be real. Prince Harry, global humanitarian, former working royal, and one half of the most scrutinized couple in the world, allegedly having a meltdown over being denied his title at a summit? It sounded more like tabloid fiction than a verified incident. But the truth had already begun leaking out from behind the tightly guarded curtains of the Nexus 2025 summit. Within hours of the summit's closing ceremony, several anonymous sources began speaking to journalists off the record. They described a scene so charged, so emotionally raw, that it stunned even seasoned staffers who had worked with political dignitaries, celebrity founders, and even foreign ministers. What emerged from their accounts wasn't just a moment of indignation, it was a psychological fracture on full display. The backstage corridors at the Nexus Summit are nothing like the pompous green rooms of Hollywood award shows or royal state dinners. They're practical, fast-moving, and intentionally utilitarian. Plastic chairs, unadorned mirrors, recycled paper itineraries pinned to corkboards. No crystal water bottles. No silk curtains. It's a space designed for preparation, not pampering. And in that utilitarian setting, everything was laid bare. Harry had arrived at the venue early that morning, escorted by 2 personal aides and a private security detail. His demeanor, according to multiple crew members, was polite but distant. He didn't engage in light banter with the volunteers as many other speakers did. He remained in his assigned holding area, eyes occasionally scanning his phone, occasionally whispering to his team. According to one of the event liaisons who interacted briefly with the Duke's entourage, there was this sense that everything had to be choreographed, even though Nexus doesn't operate that way. It was like we were dealing with a politician, not a participant. Things reportedly began unraveling when one of Harry's staffers requested to preview the speaking program just before their scheduled prep walkthrough. The assistant flipped through the program and saw what no one on Harry's team had expected. The printed schedule listed him simply as Harry Mountbatten Windsor. No prefix, no title, no royal nod. That's when the tension ignited. The staffer walked briskly over to the summit's speaker coordinator, holding the pamphlet in hand, and politely asked, "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake. His Royal Highness Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, should be the listed name." The coordinator, unfazed, responded with a calm but firm explanation. It's not a mistake. We follow a uniform policy. We don't use titles, not for royalty, not for nobility, not even for heads of state. Everyone here is equal. The staffer returned to Harry's holding area with the news. Those nearby could see an immediate shift in his demeanor. He stood up, paced a few steps, and reportedly asked in disbelief, "They're doing this to me?" Here. It was the beginning of a domino effect. According to a sound technician stationed nearby, Harry became visibly agitated as he reviewed the event documents. He was pointing at the page, shaking his head. He kept saying, "They don't get it. They just don't get it." A few moments later, Rachel Gerol herself entered the area to greet Harry personally. She extended her hand, smiled, and reportedly said, "Harry, we're so glad you're here. Thank you for being part of this important conversation." Harry's response was icy. "It's Prince Harry," he allegedly replied. "I was born a prince." Rachel, according to sources, didn't blink. "We appreciate everything you bring," she replied evenly. "But as you know, at Nexus, we address everyone by first name only. That's our community agreement." The silence that followed was described as thick. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. The air hung heavy with tension. Then Harry turned to his assistant and muttered, "We should go. This is ridiculous." That moment was the first sign that a full-blown confrontation might erupt. But no one backstage could have anticipated the scale of what would follow. Minutes later, Harry was reportedly approached by the panel moderator for a brief rundown of the format. The moderator, a well-known social entrepreneur from Brazil, greeted him cheerfully with, "Hi Harry, it's a huge honor to share the stage with you." And that, according to 3 witnesses, was the trigger. Harry raised his voice. "You people think you can strip me of who I am. I am not just Harry. I am Prince Harry. I'm not your average speaker. I'm royalty whether you like it or not." The outburst reverberated through the backstage corridors. Technicians froze. Camera crew members looked at each other, stunned. Rachel Gerol, who had moved to another area to prep other speakers, was informed immediately. Security was discreetly alerted, not because Harry posed a danger, but because things were spiraling beyond professional boundaries. One staffer described the moment as an emotional spiral in slow motion. His voice wasn't just angry. It was breaking. It was like watching someone trying to hold on to the last piece of something slipping through their fingers. As tensions mounted, several members of Harry's team tried to de-escalate. One aide reportedly placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "It's not about disrespect. It's just their protocol." But Harry wasn't having it. "My whole life, I've been told to follow protocol. And look where it got me." That comment, layered with personal trauma and royal baggage, stunned those listening. It hinted at something deeper, a reservoir of frustration that went beyond a title. This was about identity, about loss, about the pain of a man who had tried to redefine himself, only to feel erased again. Eventually, at Rachel Gerol's request, security staff gently ushered Harry to a side room where he could gather himself privately. He did not speak on the panel. He did not return to the stage. He exited the venue from a discreet side entrance under tight security. The panel went on without him. The moderator simply noted that one of the expected speakers had a last-minute schedule change. The audience, oblivious to the full details, focused on the ongoing conversation. But backstage, the aftershocks continued to ripple. Staff members debriefed with tense expressions. Volunteers whispered. And within minutes, the news had hit social media. "Prince Harry freaks out at Nexus after being called just Harry," read one anonymous post that would go viral within the hour. The story spread like wildfire. Over the next few days, more eyewitness accounts surfaced. Some sympathetic, some critical, but all pointed to the same emotional climax. A man unraveling not because his name was missing from a program, but because everything he had tried to leave behind was still tethered to his self-worth. One of the most poignant backstage testimonies came from a volunteer who had only been on site to assist with badges and check-ins. She wrote anonymously in a blog post later that week, "I don't think he meant to explode. I think he was already cracked. I think he expected this space to accept him in full, title and all, because that title is the last piece of home he still clings to. And when that was denied, he didn't know who he was anymore." In that reflection lies the true story. Not of arrogance or entitlement, but of identity loss. What played out backstage at Nexus 2025 wasn't merely a confrontation between a prince and a CEO. It was a collision between old-world symbolism and a new-world standard. A prince demanding to be seen for what he once was, and a leader insisting that what you do today matters more than what you were born into. It was two different worlds trying to coexist in a single moment, and failing. But the emotional aftermath would not be limited to that room. It would follow Harry beyond the summit doors, igniting a global conversation about titles, trauma, and transformation in a world that no longer gives weight to birthright alone. And that conversation, messy, painful, illuminating, was just beginning. It wasn't the outburst that stunned people, not entirely. Prince Harry, while not known for public displays of rage, has long been vocal, passionate, even impulsive at times. But what made the moment unforgettable and deeply revealing was the specific phrase that erupted from his mouth like a final defense mechanism. "I was born a prince. You will address me as one." It was more than a tantrum. It was a declaration, one that clung to something ancient, ceremonial, and seemingly immovable, a royal title. To the untrained eye, titles might seem like decorative flourishes, remnants of monarchies and feudal systems that hold little relevance in the democratic, fast-moving, influencer-driven societies of today. But to those who bear them, particularly those born into their weight, titles are often not a choice. They are the skin one is expected to wear, no matter how deep the chafing. For Prince Harry, the title wasn't just a name. It was his first identity. Before he could walk, talk, or understand the burden of media flashbulbs and inherited duty, the world already knew who he was. Maybe Prince Harry, son of the future king, grandson of the reigning monarch. The British public didn't wait for him to grow into a role. They projected it onto him. He was never just Harry to the world. Not in childhood, not in adolescence, not even when he begged for it in his adult years. Even when he joined the army and requested to be treated like any other soldier, his presence on the front lines became a spectacle, not a surrender to normalcy. His title followed him like a phantom, a shield, and a shadow. So when the NEXUS Summit stripped the title from his name badge and refused to invoke it during introductions, it did something far more profound than just omit a formal courtesy. It revoked his inherited identity. At least that's how it must have felt to Harry. To most of us, being referred to by a title, doctor, professor, sir, your honor, is situational. A badge of respect in certain contexts, a formality that can be casually dropped in private. But to someone born royal, the title isn't a courtesy, it's a sentence. A lifelong assignment that wraps itself around the psyche like ivy. Harry had tried to cut that ivy. He left royal duties. He gave up the use of his royal highness. He gave interviews stating his discomfort with the institution. But what many fail to understand is this: relinquishing a title doesn't remove its psychological imprint. When he shouted, "I was born a prince," he wasn't making a power play, at least not in the traditional sense. He was staking a claim to the last piece of identity he believes still legitimizes him in rooms that question his presence. What happens when the world stops caring about where you come from? What happens when legacy is no longer enough to secure relevance? These are not abstract questions for Harry. They are the defining crisis of his post-royal life. Every stage he steps onto, whether it's Oprah's garden, a Spotify podcast, or a nonprofit boardroom, is a test. Can Harry be seen, respected, or even admired without his lineage front and center? Can he compete with self-made innovators, grassroots leaders, or corporate changemakers? Not just in intention, but in earned credibility? Titles, for Harry, have become both a curse and a crutch. The curse is obvious. The royal label comes with intense scrutiny, endless expectations, and public commentary on every move. People presume arrogance, entitlement, and detachment. The media paints him as a man who wants privacy and attention simultaneously, as though the two are mutually exclusive. But the crutch is less obvious and arguably more dangerous. Because when the crowd stops applauding, when the speaking invites dwindle, when the public grows indifferent, the question becomes, what remains? If your name alone doesn't command the room anymore, will you fight for what once did? That's what played out at the NEXUS Summit. Not a battle between a prince and a CEO, but a man grappling with the erosion of identity. A man screaming into the void not because he wanted to dominate the room, but because he feared disappearing within it. And to be fair, that fear isn't irrational. The modern world, especially in the United States, doesn't value birthright the way the UK still does. America was built on the rejection of monarchy. Its institutions, educational, corporate, governmental, tend to reward merit, hustle, and individualism, even if imperfectly. In that context, a royal title isn't a ticket to reverence. It's often a punchline. That transition from divine entitlement to democratic ambiguity is a culture shock few royals survive without bruises. When Harry left the UK, he likely imagined a freer life. And in many ways, he found it. The California sun, the absence of palace walls, the ability to speak without a palace press officer rewriting his words, all of that was liberating. But what he may not have anticipated was the silence that followed. Not the media silence that never came, but the silence of not matching in the same way. The silence of no longer being bowed to, revered, or automatically respected. In London, he was His Royal Highness. In Los Angeles, he's just one of many exiles trying to reinvent themselves. That dissonance explains the power of the words, "I was born a prince." They are not merely factual. They are defiant. They scream, "I still matter. I still belong. I am still somebody." Of course, to critics, that outburst confirmed their worst assumptions. That beneath the carefully polished interviews and philanthropic branding, Harry still clings to the trappings of royalty. That despite leaving the institution, he hasn't let go of the need for the validation it once provided. But those critiques, while sharp, often ignore the emotional complexity beneath the surface. Identity, once torn from its roots, doesn't regrow overnight. It flails, it clings, it mourns. And in Harry's case, it often lashes out. The power of a title isn't in the words themselves. It's in what they represent. For Harry, Prince isn't just a nod to tradition. It's a link to a mother who was revered and lost, a father who was distant, a family that remains fractured. It's the only thing that's remained constant while everything else in his world, his marriage, his homeland, his reputation, has been in flux. So when Rachel Gerol refused to use the title, she didn't just break protocol. She touched a nerve. She forced Harry to confront a version of himself that he may not fully recognize. A version stripped of regalia, standing beside other speakers who built themselves from nothing. And in that confrontation, Harry's reflex was not humility, it was resistance. Because in that moment, the power of the title wasn't ceremonial. It was survival. Long before she became the woman who publicly defied a British royal, Rachel Gerol was known within certain circles as a quiet revolutionary, someone who believed that influence should be earned, not inherited, and that leadership wasn't about legacy, but about action. In the world of modern philanthropy and social innovation, her name carried weight not because of lavish displays of power, but because of how deliberately she chose not to participate in them. To many, she was invisible, not because she lacked importance, but because she didn't seek the spotlight. And in a world increasingly defined by spectacle and celebrity, that was its own form of rebellion. So when Rachel Gerol refused to address Prince Harry by his title at the NEXUS 2025 Summit, it wasn't a spontaneous act of defiance. It was the result of years of conviction, a moment that had been brewing long before the prince ever set foot in the building. Gerol's story begins far from palaces or penthouses. Raised in a working-class suburb of Madison, Wisconsin, she grew up surrounded by educators, factory workers, and community organizers. Her mother was a public school teacher. Her father worked at the local water treatment plant. Neither had a college degree, but both instilled in her the belief that intellect and empathy, not wealth or bloodlines, were the true markers of leadership. Rachel excelled academically. She was the type of student who didn't just win science fairs, she restructured them. By the time she entered NYU on a full scholarship, she had already launched a statewide initiative connecting low-income students with mentorship programs. She studied political science and sociology, but her true education came in the streets of Jakarta, Nairobi, and Rio, where she spent her post-college years embedded in social development projects. While other graduates chased internships at consulting firms and multinational banks, Gerol worked alongside microfinance startups in Indonesia and youth-led education programs in Brazil. She wasn't studying inequality. She was living inside its consequences. That immersion shaped her worldview permanently. She came to understand power not as something bestowed, but as something constructed, often on the backs of those who never received credit. She also came to loathe the institutional hypocrisy that dominated many philanthropic spaces. Billionaires donating to poverty eradication initiatives while evading taxes, celebrities speaking about hunger while wearing jewelry worth the GDP of a small village, royal figures discussing climate change while flying in private jets. Gerol returned to the United States with one goal in mind: build a platform where power was decentralized, where voices were not ranked by lineage or LinkedIn profiles. That platform became NEXUS. When she co-founded the organization in 2011, it was small, a boutique gathering of young changemakers focused on sustainable development, ethical investing, and global collaboration. But under her leadership, it grew exponentially, not just in numbers but in integrity. One of the founding principles of Nexus, written on the very first internal charter, was simple: respect is not a reward for your last name. This principle became the heartbeat of the organization's culture. Titles were removed from name badges. First names only. All participants, regardless of status, were to be treated equally, whether you were the son of a prince or the founder of a climate lab in rural India. Rachel was relentless in enforcing this. Over the years, she quietly turned down major speakers who insisted on being introduced with formal titles. She rejected sponsorships from corporations with exploitative labor records. She even once asked the niece of a former U.S. president to sit at the back of a round table because she arrived late. People either respected her fiercely or avoided her entirely. But what they didn't do until Nexus 2025 was challenge her principles on a global stage. When Prince Harry's team reached out expressing interest in the summit, it caused a ripple internally. Some staff members were thrilled. Harry was a high-profile figure, and his appearance would guarantee press coverage. Others were cautious, remembering how easily traditional structures could hijack egalitarian spaces. Rachel was wary. Not because she disliked Harry personally, in fact, she had spoken positively about his mental health work in past interviews, but because she saw a pattern she had seen too many times before. A famous man with inherited fame seeking a platform to reinforce an identity that, by her standards, needed re-examination. According to several Nexus insiders, Rachel agreed to consider Harry's participation under two conditions. First, he would be addressed as Harry, not Prince. Second, he would share stage time equally with others. No monologues, no keynote solos, no preferential treatment and scheduling. Harry's team agreed. But whether they fully understood what that agreement meant, or whether they assumed flexibility in implementation, remains unclear. When Rachel greeted Harry backstage with a simple "Harry, thank you for being here," she was not being disrespectful. She was being consistent. What followed, the tension, the outburst, the confrontation, tested her values like never before. Some might have wavered in that moment. A lesser leader might have made a quiet exception, called him "Your Royal Highness" once in passing, smoothed things over for optics. But Rachel stood her ground. According to witnesses, her voice didn't rise. She didn't push back with aggression. She simply reminded him, calmly and firmly, that at Nexus, no one is their title. Everyone is their work. To her, the refusal to call him Prince wasn't about humiliation. It was about integrity. In a post-event staff memo, later leaked to the press, Rachel wrote, "We are not anti-royal. We are anti-idolatry. Our job is not to validate power but to democratize it. Titles are not badges of truth. They are reminders of a world we are trying to move beyond." In that statement lies the key to Rachel Gerol's leadership style. She wasn't trying to attack Harry. She was trying to defend a principle, one that had become increasingly rare in a world where influence often trumps ideals. Of course, not everyone agreed with her stance. In the days that followed the incident, debates erupted across media platforms. Some called her courageous. Others called her condescending. Royalist commentators accused her of disrespecting the British monarchy. American commentators accused her of being needlessly provocative. But what became clear, through all the noise, was that Rachel Gerol had struck a nerve. She had exposed the fragility of constructed identity. She had reminded people that outside the gates of inherited power, the rules change. And in doing so, she posed a question that now lingers far beyond the summit. If your voice is only heard when your title precedes it, was it ever your voice to begin with? The incident had barely cooled backstage when the first whispers escaped into the digital ether. Within minutes of Prince Harry's abrupt departure from the Nexus 2025 Summit's green room, the world was already watching. Not through official press statements or polished media coverage, but through blurry tweets, behind-the-scenes whispers, and unverified messages bouncing between WhatsApp threads and Reddit boards. It wasn't just a story. It was a live unfolding drama, and the internet loves nothing more than a scandal involving a royal caught off guard, especially when it involves entitlement clashing with egalitarian ideals. By the time the summit concluded that evening, social media platforms were in overdrive. The phrase, "just Harry," was trending globally on X, formerly known as Twitter. Memes exploded across timelines. One image showed a stick figure with a crown being erased by an office marker, captioned, "Nexus Protocol Activated." Another featured a cartoon version of Gerol handing Harry a name tag with "Hello, my name is Harry," while a visibly upset Harry stomped off. But it wasn't all jokes and ridicule. Beneath the viral memes, a cultural conversation had ignited. A loud, complicated, and often emotionally charged dialogue about power, relevance, legacy, and identity began to take hold. And like any modern controversy, the internet quickly carved itself into two opposing camps. On one side were the defenders, Harry's loyal supporters, royal traditionalists, and those who viewed the incident as a deliberate slight against someone who had endured more than his fair share of public scrutiny and institutional trauma. These supporters argued that Harry had earned his title, not simply by birth but through service, and that stripping him of that recognition was an unnecessary public insult. He fought in Afghanistan. He started Invictus Games. He's been more active in mental health advocacy than most government leaders. He is Prince Harry, and that means something, wrote one user in a widely shared post on Facebook. Others framed Gerol's refusal as performative, an act of pseudo-wokeness that disrespected international decorum. Rachel wouldn't talk to Macron like that. Or Obama. So why Harry? It's selective humility, and it reeks of hypocrisy, read another opinion on LinkedIn. On the other side, voices emerged who saw Harry's behavior not as defensible, but as the latest example of unchecked royal ego struggling to adapt to modern standards of equality. They praised Gerol for standing firm and refusing to make an exception, especially in a space designed to flatten hierarchies. One TikTok clip went viral showing a young Nexus volunteer narrating her experience. He walked in with a title, but everyone else walked in with ideas. That's the difference. The clip, backed by dramatic music and snippets of Harry's outburst reenacted with sock puppets, had over 5 million views in just 24 hours. Mainstream media quickly followed. Every major outlet, BBC, CNN, The Guardian, The Times, Washington Post, The Daily Mail, scrambled to verify the account and build a narrative around the now infamous backstage standoff. Though Nexus initially declined to provide a comment beyond their earlier statement, leaks from staff and summit insiders gave reporters enough to publish timelines, quotes, and play-by-play reconstructions. The Daily Mail ran with the headline, "Prince or Pauper? Harry storms out after Nexus snub," predictably painting Harry as emotionally fragile and disconnected from reality. Meanwhile, the New York Times took a more nuanced approach, titling their story, "Legacy Meets Meritocracy, the Clash That Shook Nexus." Late-night talk shows wasted no time weighing in. Comedians seized the moment. One mock sketch on The Late Show featured a fake Nexus stage where a Prince Harry impersonator whined about missing his golden cushion. While some laughed, others analyzed. Public intellectuals and cultural critics began publishing opinion pieces dissecting the meaning behind the moment. Was this about power? Was it about class? Was it about trauma or ego or both? An op-ed in The Atlantic observed. This wasn't just a dispute over a title. It was a rupture between old-world decorum and new-world ethics. In an era where leadership is measured in action rather than ancestry, Harry's reaction feels less like indignation and more like desperation. Others took the opportunity to revisit Harry's broader journey since his departure from the royal family, questioning whether his efforts at reinvention had ever truly detached from the institution he tried to leave behind. As the news cycle widened, another curious development occurred. Celebrities began to weigh in, and their responses only intensified the public divide. Actor and philanthropist Idris Elba, who had DJ'd Harry and Meghan's wedding reception years earlier, tweeted, "Titles don't matter where real work begins." Still got love for Harry. But Rachel did what leaders do, lead. In contrast, Piers Morgan, never one to pass on a chance to criticize Harry, launched into a 20-minute televised rant calling him a pampered crybaby who thinks he's still owed reverence despite quitting the job. But perhaps most surprising was the silence from Meghan Markle. For days, her name trended alongside Harry's, with speculation mounting. Why wasn't she at Nexus? Did she advise Harry not to attend? Had she disagreed with his reaction? The public wanted answers, and the lack of any official response only fueled the theories. Some tabloids suggested Meghan had quietly distanced herself from the summit and had been informed in advance that Nexus would not honor royal titles. Others speculated she had urged Harry to walk away the moment he saw the program's layout. There were even claims that the couple had fought over the fallout, that Meghan, known for being strategic, saw the whole situation as a preventable mess. While none of these theories were confirmed, one thing became increasingly clear: the fallout wasn't just public. It was personal. Inside the Nexus network, meanwhile, Rachel Gerol was being both celebrated and scrutinized. She received countless messages from current and former summit participants praising her integrity, thanking her for not bending the rules for status. But she also received hate mail, accusations of cultural insensitivity, and claims that she had used the incident to raise her own profile. Despite the noise, Gerol remained silent. She made no television appearances. She gave no interviews. A week later, she published a single blog post titled, "Why We Are First Name Only," where she explained the summit's philosophy without mentioning Harry once. That post went viral, not because of its drama, but because of its clarity. She wrote, "When we remove titles, we remove the temptation to assign value before we hear voices. Everyone at our summit enters equally, and what they do from there is what sets them apart." The ripple effects of the moment continued for weeks. Event organizers across other leadership summits and philanthropy forums began revisiting their own speaker policies. Discussions flared across college campuses. Social media think pieces flooded platforms like Substack and Medium. Even some corporations began experimenting with no-title policies and internal meetings, a ripple born from one clash of ideals on a New York stage. For Harry, the fallout was more complicated. Despite issuing a brief statement attempting to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding, he remained under intense scrutiny. In the public imagination, he had crossed a line, not just of decorum, but of tone deafness. In a time when many are struggling just to be heard, a man born into global fame demanding recognition because of his lineage felt increasingly out of step. Yet, in quieter corners of the conversation, there was also empathy. A therapist writing for Psychology Today observed, "Harry's reaction may not have been appropriate, but it was deeply human. For someone whose identity was shaped by title, tradition, and trauma, the removal of that title in public could feel like the erasure of self. It doesn't justify the behavior, but it does explain it." By the end of the month, the firestorm had begun to cool. New headlines emerged: a celebrity divorce, a global summit on climate change. The media turned its attention elsewhere. But for those who watched the Nexus moment unfold, not just as gossip, but as a mirror, something fundamental had shifted. The idea that birthrights still guaranteed deference had been publicly challenged, and a new cultural line had been drawn. In a single afternoon, one man's demand to be addressed as Prince had opened up a global dialogue about who we are without our titles, and whether we're prepared to let actions, not ancestry, speak for us. In the aftermath of Prince Harry's public outburst at the Nexus 2025 summit, one name began surfacing in nearly every conversation, even though she had been entirely absent from the event: Meghan Markle. The Duchess of Sussex, a woman never far from the epicenter of media attention, had chosen, either by strategy or circumstance, to remain completely silent during one of the most volatile public moments in her husband's post-royal life. Her absence raised questions. Her silence raised even more. In the chaotic media whirlwind that followed Harry's backstage confrontation and storm out, Meghan's name appeared alongside his in nearly every headline, not because she had done anything, but precisely because she hadn't. No tweet, no statement, no carefully curated Instagram post, not even a quote from a source close to Meghan. And for a woman known for being acutely aware of the power of narrative, that silence was deafening. In fact, it was so unusual that it became its own story. Speculation mushroomed overnight. Commentators wondered aloud on live television whether Meghan had stayed away from the summit on purpose, anticipating the very kind of meltdown that occurred. Others questioned whether the couple was divided on how to approach their post-royal image. In the past, Meghan had been the more calculated half of the duo, often guiding their public engagements with precision. Now, with Harry seemingly operating alone, the contrast in tone was jarring. What added fuel to the speculation was the revelation, leaked by an anonymous Nexus staffer, that Meghan had originally been invited alongside Harry as a potential co-panelist. According to internal emails reviewed by investigative journalists, early summit drafts had included a joint appearance from the Sussexes, where they would participate in a moderated dialogue about power, responsibility, and media. At some point in the planning process, Meghan quietly withdrew. No reason was publicly given, but according to insiders, she cited a scheduling conflict with prior commitments in Los Angeles. That decision was made months before the summit. In hindsight, many saw it differently. A former Archwell staffer, speaking under condition of anonymity, claimed that Meghan had reviewed the NEXUS protocols in detail before stepping back. She's not impulsive. She reads the fine print. The summit's policy on non-use of titles didn't sit well with Harry, but Meghan understood that walking into a space like that required humility. She didn't want to risk being rejected on a symbolic level. She knew the risk. And I think, privately, she advised Harry to be cautious. This revelation painted a picture of a deliberate withdrawal, one grounded in self-preservation and image management. But it also hinted at deeper tensions between Meghan and Harry regarding their public roles. In recent months, subtle cracks had begun appearing in their seemingly unified front. Meghan had taken solo meetings with executives in Silicon Valley, reportedly in pursuit of rebranding herself as a wellness and leadership figure. Harry had shown up at events alone, looking less polished, less choreographed, and, according to some insiders, increasingly agitated by his shifting public status. The NEXUS Summit seemed to throw that dynamic into sharp relief. In the days following the event, while Harry was being dragged across headlines and parroted in late-night sketches, Meghan remained cloaked in silence, not even a photo op at a charity center or a surprise podcast drop. The couple, normally so in sync, appeared to be operating on two entirely different wavelengths. Some experts in public relations called it a tactical silence. Meghan, they argued, was too media-savvy to speak out during a volatile PR moment. Anything she said would be picked apart, distorted, and possibly used as ammunition against both of them. Better to remain quiet and let the storm burn itself out. Others weren't convinced it was just strategy. To them, it looked like distance, emotional, not just physical. A deliberate pulling away from an event that may have exposed rifts not just between Harry and the summit, but between Harry and Meghan. Tabloids leapt on the idea. Is Meghan washing her hands of Harry's PR mess? Read one front-page headline. Duchess goes MIA as Duke faces fallout, read another. For a couple so closely scrutinized, the speculation was inevitable, but this time, it carried more weight. The more critical observers began to revisit Meghan's own history with public reputation and control. Since the couple's dramatic departure from royal life, she had been extremely careful about the image she projected. Whether through Oprah's interview, the Netflix docuseries, or the Spotify podcast, Meghan's narrative had been clear. She was poised, principled, and measured. She was a victim of institutional cruelty, yes, but also someone who rose above it. Any association with emotional volatility, especially that exhibited by her husband at NEXUS, would not align with her current public trajectory. Privately, people close to the couple began whispering about disagreements that had surfaced in the weeks leading up to the summit. According to one source familiar with Archwell's inner workings, Harry felt like he needed to reassert himself publicly. Meghan didn't see the point. She's focused on building a different kind of credibility, one that doesn't require the royal tag. The divide was subtle, but real. Meghan's path seemed to be moving toward becoming an international lifestyle figure, someone admired for wisdom, wellness, and quiet resilience. Harry, by contrast, was still fighting to be heard, fighting to matter, and, in many ways, still clinging to the weight of the world he'd left behind. NEXUS may have exposed just how differently they saw themselves and the world around them. Yet, despite all the noise, Meghan maintained her silence. She didn't refute the stories. She didn't appear on a podcast to shift the narrative. Even her usual allies in the media platforms that had once championed her side of every controversy seemed unsure of how to interpret her absence. That silence, paradoxically, made her seem stronger in the eyes of some. In an age where overreaction is often punished and public overexposure leads to burnout, Meghan's decision not to wade into the mess may have been the most calculated move of all. By saying nothing, she allowed the storm to circle Harry and Harry alone. But others saw the silence not as strength, but as abandonment. Was this a case of Meghan protecting her brand? Or was it a moment when she genuinely disagreed with how Harry had handled himself and chose not to co-sign his actions? There were no clear answers. And perhaps that was the point. What became increasingly clear, however, was that this silence created a void, and in that void, assumptions, stories, and judgments grew like wildfire. The world doesn't like silence from public figures. It interprets it, weaponizes it, And in Meghan's case, the interpretations were growing increasingly complex. A month after the summit, Meghan finally re-emerged publicly, not with a press conference, not with a formal address, but with a quiet visit to a women's literacy initiative in Oakland. Dressed in understated neutral tones, she spent 2 hours listening to stories, posing for a few photos, and then leaving without making a statement. That visit was covered in the press, but barely. The focus was still on Harry's NEXUS outburst and the couple's conflicting public tones. For once, Meghan wasn't leading the narrative, and perhaps that was exactly what she intended. What's clear now, in the wake of NEXUS, is that the incident didn't just mark a turning point for Prince Harry's public identity. It also created a defining moment for Meghan, one shaped not by what she said, but by what she chose not to say. Whether tactical or tense, her silence spoke volumes. At the prestigious NEXUS 2025 Summit, where world leaders, changemakers, and innovators gather on equal footing, Prince Harry reportedly exploded backstage after CEO Rachel Gerol refused to address him by his royal title. Eyewitnesses claim he stormed off, shouting, "I was born a prince. You will address me as one," and had to be escorted by security to a private room. But this wasn't just a meltdown. It was a seismic clash between legacy and meritocracy, tradition and modern power. In the next few minutes, we'll unpack what really happened behind the scenes, why Rachel Gerol stood firm, and how this moment may have finally shattered Harry's post-royal image.